There's a lie the gardening world tells you, and it sounds a lot like this. If it survives in the ground, it'll survive in a pot. I believed that lie for years. I built entire container gardens around it. And then one by one, plants I trusted the most, plants every gardening blog told me were easy, betrayed me. Roots cracked through terracotta. Winters wiped out perennials that should have come back stronger. Some plants didn't just struggle, they took other plants down with them. By the end of this video, you're going to look at your own containers completely differently, because chances are, you're already repeating at least one of my 10 biggest regrets, and you don't even know it yet. Welcome to Evergreen Garden Life. Before we get into this, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because this channel is all about the stuff nobody tells you until you've already made the mistake yourself. So here's the thing nobody really explains properly, and I mean nobody, not the plant tags at the garden center, not most of the gardening books sitting on shelves in bookstores from London to Los Angeles, not even the well-meaning neighbor who hands you a cutting over the fence and says, "Oh, this thing grows anywhere." A perennial in the ground and a perennial in a pot are basically living two completely different lives. Even though they're the exact same species, sometimes even cuttings taken from the exact same parent plant, genetically identical down to the last cell. In the ground, roots can go wherever they want. They spread out sideways searching for nutrients. They dig down deep to escape frost and drought. They find their own moisture in the surrounding soil because the earth itself acts like a massive, slow-moving reservoir that's been building up water and minerals for years, sometimes decades, before that plant ever showed up. And the soil around those roots acts like a buffer, keeping temperature swings gentle and predictable, so even during a cold snap in early spring, the ground several inches down barely notices what's happening on the surface. You could have frost on the grass blades and the soil 4 inches below could still be a relatively mild temperature, protecting whatever roots happen to be living down there. That's the quiet advantage of the ground that we almost never think about, because we don't see it, we just see the plant surviving and assume the plant itself is simply tough. A pot doesn't offer any of that. A pot is a box. A hard, unforgiving, temperature-swinging box that exposes roots on every single side to whatever the weather happens to be doing that day. With nothing standing between the elements and the root system except a thin wall of plastic, terracotta, or ceramic. There's no reservoir, there's no buffer, there's just a finite amount of soil crammed into a finite amount of space, and every drop of rain, every gust of wind, every sudden frost hits that soil directly, almost instantly, with none of the gradual softening that ground soil provides. So when a plant tag says hardy perennial, thrives in full sun, drought-tolerant once established, that claim was almost certainly tested in the ground, in a trial garden somewhere with deep, undisturbed soil, not in a container sitting on a concrete patio in Manchester, or a balcony 14 floors up in Chicago getting blasted by wind that never touches a garden bed at ground level, or a sun-baked deck in the American Southwest, where the pot itself can heat up like an oven under direct afternoon sun. This is exactly why so many of us, myself included, end up disappointed, and honestly a little embarrassed, because we did everything the label told us to do. We read the tag, we checked the hardiness zone, we picked the right amount of sun exposure. We followed every instruction to the letter. We take a plant that's genuinely tough and reliable in a garden bed, something our grandparents might have grown without a second thought in the same patch of earth for 30 years. And we assume that toughness just transfers over to pot life automatically. It doesn't. It really doesn't. And that disconnect is honestly the entire premise of this video. Root systems that were built over thousands of years of evolution to spread outward, searching, foraging, adapting to whatever conditions they encounter, suddenly hit a wall, literally, physically, a hard plastic or ceramic wall that simply wasn't part of the evolutionary equation. And instead of stopping gracefully, instead of just pausing and waiting patiently, they start circling in on themselves, wrapping around and around the inside edge of the pot like a plant trying to escape a maze with no exit. This is called root girdling, and it's one of the sneakiest problems in container gardening because you don't see it happening. There's no dramatic moment, no single day where you can point and say, "That's when it went wrong." It's happening underground, slowly, silently strangling the plant's own root system month after month, tightening like a very slow noose. And by the time you notice the leaves yellowing, the stems weakening, the blooms disappearing entirely, The damage has usually been going on for the better part of a year, sometimes longer, sometimes so long that by the time you catch it, there's genuinely nothing left to save. Now let's talk about the actual risk here, because this isn't just about a plant looking a little sad on your patio. This isn't some minor cosmetic inconvenience you can just prune away and forget about. There's real cost involved, and I mean real, tangible, wallet-emptying cost. I'm talking about cracked containers, and I don't mean small hairline cracks you can patch with some sealant and forget about over a weekend. I mean full splits running down the entire side of a terracotta pot that cost you $30, $40, sometimes well over $100, because a root system expanded with more raw force than the material could physically withstand. Terracotta is not as forgiving as it looks. It's fired clay, it's rigid, and when a root system pushes outward with enough sustained pressure over enough time, something has to give, and it's almost always the pot. I've had this happen with ornamental grasses that looked completely fine on the surface, healthy green, swaying beautifully in the breeze, absolutely nothing wrong from what I could see standing there with my morning coffee, while underneath, the roots were literally breaking the pot apart from the inside like something out of a slow-motion disaster film that nobody's filming. You don't notice it until one morning you walk outside, and there's a 2-inch crack running from the rim all the way down to the base, and soil spilling out onto your patio stones like the pot is quietly bleeding out. And once that crack forms, there's really no fixing it properly. You're either living with an ugly, unstable pot, or you're buying a replacement and going through the whole disruptive process of transplanting a root-bound plant, which comes with its own set of risks. There's also the financial loss of losing an entire plant that you invested real money into, and I don't just mean the purchase price at the nursery. I mean plants that take 2 or 3 years to mature into something genuinely beautiful. Plants you've fed, watered, fussed over, moved in and out for the seasons, celebrated every new bloom on, only to watch them collapse in a single harsh winter because a container offers essentially zero insulation compared to garden soil. One brutal cold snap, one night where the temperature drops further than forecast, further than anyone expected, and years of patient growing can be undone in a matter of hours while you're asleep inside, completely unaware. That's not an exaggeration, that's just physics, cold physics, and it's happened to me more than once, which is honestly a hard thing to admit on camera. And here's the part that really stings, the part that doesn't show up on any receipt, doesn't show up in any spreadsheet of gardening expenses, the emotional cost. If you've been gardening for any length of time, you already know that plants aren't just plants, not really, not to the people who grow them. You remember where you got them, who gave them to you, what season it was when you planted them, what was happening in your life at the time, whether it was a difficult year or a joyful one. Losing a perennial you've nurtured for years because of a mistake you didn't even know you were making. That's a specific, quiet kind of frustration that makes you want to just give up on containers altogether and stick to annuals you buy fresh every spring without getting attached, without investing that same emotional weight into something that might just disappoint you again. I've been there. I nearly walked away from container gardening completely because of one particular plant on this list, and trust me, we'll get to that story before this video is over, because it's honestly the whole reason I started paying attention to any of this in the first place. So what actually causes all of this? Let's break it down into the real, underlying factors, because once you understand these, the rest of this video, and honestly the rest of your container gardening journey going forward, is going to make a lot more sense. This isn't about memorizing 10 plant names and avoiding them forever. It's about understanding the patterns underneath, so you can spot the next mistake before you make it, with plants that aren't even on this list. The first factor is root architecture mismatch, which is exactly what we just talked about. Plants with aggressive spreading roots or deep, stubborn taproots simply weren't designed by nature for confined spaces, and no amount of good intentions on your part, no amount of extra fertilizer or careful watering, changes that basic biological fact. You can't outcare bad root architecture. It's baked into the plant before you ever bring it home. The second factor is winter exposure, and this one deserves some real attention because it trips up even experienced gardeners across colder climates in the UK, the northern United States, and much of continental Europe, places where winters are genuinely serious business, and not just a light dusting of frost that melts by noon. In the ground, frost has to travel through layers and layers of insulating soil before it ever reaches a root system. which buys the plant time and softens the impact considerably. In a pot, especially a thin plastic or ceramic one, the cold hits the roots almost directly from all sides at once, with barely any buffer at all, which means a plant rated hardy to your exact climate zone. A zone you carefully checked before buying it, standing there in the nursery double-checking the label, can still freeze solid and die in a container when it would have survived just fine planted directly in the earth a few feet away, in the exact same yard, under the exact same weather conditions. The third factor, and honestly this one caught me off guard the most out of everything on this list, more than any of the others, is companion mismatch. When you plant multiple perennials together in the same pot, which most of us do because let's be honest, mixed containers look absolutely stunning on a patio or a front step, full and layered and professionally styled. You're often unknowingly forcing plants with completely different water and light needs to share the exact same soil, the exact same drainage, the exact same conditions, whether they like it or not. One plant ends up essentially drowning while its neighbor is quietly dying of thirst just inches away in that same pot, sharing the same watering can, the same rainfall, the same sun exposure. And you won't even realize that's the actual root of the problem, pun fully intended. You'll just assume you're bad at watering, you'll blame yourself, you'll start second-guessing your entire routine, maybe even watering more or less trying to fix it, when really the two plants were simply never compatible roommates to begin with, and no watering schedule in the world was ever going to make that pairing work. And the fourth factor is simply choosing the wrong scale of plant from the very beginning, picking a full-sized garden variety instead of a dwarf or compact cultivar that was actually bred, specifically and intentionally, with container life in mind by growers who understood exactly this problem. This sounds like such a small detail, almost too obvious to mention. Easy to skip past when you're standing in a nursery excited about a plant's flowers or foliage, but it's responsible for more container disasters than almost anything else on this entire list, and we're going to see that pattern repeat itself multiple times as we get into the countdown. Alright, with all of that groundwork properly laid, let's get into the actual list. 10 perennials, counting down from the plant that disappointed me the least, all the way to the one that genuinely, seriously, nearly made me quit this hobby entirely, the one I still think about every time I walk past that spot on my patio. Number 10 on my list is bee balm. I planted bee balm because I wanted hummingbirds and bees swarming my patio all summer long, filling the air with that gorgeous fragrance and constant motion. And honestly, it delivered on that promise beautifully, for about one glorious season. The flowers were incredible, tall and vivid and almost tropical looking. The pollinators showed up right on schedule like they'd gotten a personal invitation. And I remember thinking I'd finally cracked the code on container perennials, that I was officially good at this now. What nobody warned me about is how aggressively the roots spread underground through rhizomes, constantly pushing outward in search of new ground to colonize. And in a pot, those rhizomes don't have anywhere to go except in tight, suffocating circles around themselves, over and over, layer after layer, tangling into a dense mat. By the second year, the plant was so root-bound it stopped flowering almost entirely, producing maybe 2 or 3 sad blooms where there used to be dozens crowding the top of the pot. No amount of fertilizer brought it back, no amount of extra water helped, because the problem was never nutrition, it was space, plain and simple, and no bag of plant food was ever going to fix that. Number 9 is catmint. This one genuinely hurts to admit because catmint gets marketed constantly, relentlessly even, across gardening magazines and nursery displays, as the perfect low-maintenance container plant. And in fairness, some of the newer compact cultivars genuinely are exactly that, well-behaved and tidy. But I didn't do my homework properly, and I planted a standard, full-sized variety instead of one of those compact ones. And it grew so vigorously, so aggressively, that it completely overwhelmed the other plants sharing that same pot within a matter of weeks, not months, weeks. It hogged the water, it blocked the light from smaller companions crowded beneath its sprawling growth, and it just kept expanding outward until those other plants simply gave up trying to compete and quietly died back, leaving me with one enormous catmint and a graveyard of everything else I'd planted alongside it. Number 8 is ornamental grass, specifically a variety that looked absolutely stunning sitting in the nursery, tall, elegant, swaying dramatically in even the slightest breeze. Exactly the kind of statement piece I wanted anchoring my patio arrangement. I was so proud of that container. I remember showing it off to visitors. Within 2 seasons though, the dense root mass underneath had physically cracked my container down one entire side. A crack I didn't even notice until it had already split most of the way to the base, hidden behind the foliage where I wasn't looking closely. I genuinely didn't know that was possible until I saw it happen with my own eyes. A plant literally breaking apart its own home from the inside out, patiently, relentlessly, without making a single sound until the damage was already done. Number 7 is hosta, and this one is more of a slow burn regret rather than a dramatic disaster. More of a persistent annoyance than a single heartbreaking moment. Hostas need surprisingly large containers to properly accommodate their expanding root systems as they mature, much larger than their compact appearance above soil would ever suggest. And mine outgrew its pot so quickly, faster than I ever anticipated, that I found myself repotting it every single year just to keep it healthy and happy, hauling bags of fresh soil and wrestling with an increasingly heavy container each spring. That's a level of ongoing maintenance I genuinely wasn't prepared for when I first bought it. Thinking hostas were about as low effort as perennials get, practically the poster child for shade garden simplicity. Number 6 is bearded iris. The issue here is specific and honestly kind of fascinating once you understand the mechanics behind it. Iris rhizomes need to sit partially exposed right at the soil surface in order to thrive. That's just how they're built. Sunbathing right at ground level rather than buried deep like most roots. But in a container, that exposed rhizome takes the full unfiltered brunt of freeze-thaw cycles all winter long, heaving up out of the soil repeatedly with each thaw and refreeze, shifting position again and again as the soil around it expands and contracts, until the delicate roots underneath were simply too damaged, too disturbed, too destabilized to ever properly recover and anchor the plant again. Number 5 is peony. And if you've ever grown peonies yourself, you already know exactly where this story is going, because peony growers tend to share this particular scar in common. Peonies despise having their roots disturbed. It's practically their defining personality trait as a plant, almost stubbornly so. I made the well-intentioned mistake of repotting mine into a slightly bigger container, thinking I was helping it grow more comfortably, giving it room to stretch out, and it sulked, genuinely sulked, for 3 entire years without producing a single bloom. Not one, just green foliage year after year with no reward for my patience. 3 years. That's not a plant that forgives easily, and that's not an exaggeration for dramatic effect either. That's exactly what happened in my own backyard, season after disappointing season. Number 4 is daylily, specifically a full-sized variety instead of a compact one like Stella d'Oro, which I now recommend to literally everyone who asks me about container perennials, practically evangelizing for it at this point. I underestimated how much room these things actually need to grow and spread properly, assuming daylilies were forgiving enough to handle tighter quarters, and mine ended up so cramped and root-bound within its pot that what should have been months of continuous, cheerful blooms turned into just a handful of sad, half-hearted flowers scattered thinly across an entire summer. Nothing like the abundant displays I'd seen in other people's gardens. Number 3 is astilbe, and this is where that water mismatch factor I mentioned earlier really came back to bite me, hard, in a way I genuinely didn't see coming. Astilbe needs consistently moist soil at all times, no exceptions, practically thirsty by nature, but I paired it in a mixed container with drought-tolerant companions that preferred to dry out between waterings. An aesthetic pairing that looked beautiful on paper and in the nursery cart. Containers dry out so much faster than garden beds ever do, and I simply could not keep both plants satisfied at the same time, no matter how carefully I tried to balance my watering schedule, adjusting and readjusting week after week. One of them was always suffering, always a little wilted, no matter what I did, and eventually I had to accept that the pairing itself was the mistake, not my technique. Number 2 is hellebore, and this is a big one for me personally, because hellebores are marketed absolutely everywhere as perfect winter container plants thanks to their early blooms and impressive shade tolerance, practically celebrated as the answer to dull winter patios. What almost nobody tells you, and I mean almost nobody, not the marketing, not the plant tags, is that their fleshy roots deeply, deeply dislike being disturbed, and they need stable, cool, remarkably consistent soil conditions that even large, expensive containers genuinely struggle to replicate over time, no matter how much you spend on the pot itself. My hellebore limped along for 2 full years, barely blooming, looking perpetually tired and unenthusiastic, a shadow of the lush photos I'd seen online, before I finally understood it was simply never going to thrive the way it would have if I'd just planted it directly in the ground from the very beginning, saving myself 2 years of quiet disappointment. And number 1, the plant that nearly made me walk away from container gardening entirely, the one I genuinely hesitated to include on this list, because talking about it still makes me wince a little, is mint. I know, everyone tells you to grow mint in a pot specifically because it's so notoriously invasive in the ground, and that advice isn't wrong. Mint absolutely will take over an entire garden bed if you let it roam free, choking out everything around it within a single season. But here's what nobody warns you about, the part that no one ever mentions in those cheerful grow mint in containers articles you see shared everywhere. If that pot sits directly on soil, even for just one single season, mint roots will find their way out through the drainage holes at the bottom and escape into the ground below without you ever noticing, sneaking out right under your feet. Mine did exactly that, and by the time I finally noticed something was wrong, weeks or maybe months after it had already happened, it had spread underneath 3 other containers sitting nearby, tangling itself thoroughly into their root systems, creating an absolute chaotic mess that took me an entire weekend. An entire exhausting, dirt under the fingernails weekend, to properly untangle and remove, plant by plant, root by root. So now that you know all 10 mistakes, let's talk about what you can actually do differently going forward, because this video was never meant to scare you away from growing perennials in containers. It's meant to help you actually succeed with them the way I eventually did, once I finally understood what was going wrong and why. First, always check whether a cultivar has been specifically bred as dwarf, compact, or container-friendly before you buy it. Look for those words right there on the tag or ask the nursery staff directly if it isn't listed. That single detail alone prevents most of the outgrowing problems we just walked through together. Second, when it comes to winter, either move your containers somewhere sheltered, like against a house wall, or into an unheated garage where temperatures stay more stable, or choose a plant rated at least 1 full hardiness zone tougher than your actual climate zone. That extra buffer accounts for the lack of insulation a pot provides compared to open ground. Third, stop mixing plants with wildly different water needs into the same container. I know it feels restrictive at first, especially if you love the aesthetic of varied mixed plantings and don't want to sacrifice that layered, professional look, but grouping plants by similar water and light requirements will save you from that slow, confusing decline where you genuinely think you're doing something wrong, when really, the plants were just never meant to be roommates in the first place, no matter how good they look together at the nursery. Fourth, elevate your pots slightly off the ground using pot feet or even simple bricks, something as small as a few inches of clearance. This one simple trick improves drainage dramatically, prevents root escape through the bottom like what happened with my mint disaster, and reduces the freeze-thaw damage that comes from pots sitting directly on cold concrete or bare soil all winter. And finally, budget time every year or 2 specifically for repotting and root pruning. Mark it on a calendar if you have to. Treat it as routine, expected maintenance rather than some emergency fix you scramble to do once things have already gone wrong. Because if I'm being completely honest with you, most of the disasters on this list happened simply because I let a problem sit unaddressed for 2 or 3 seasons before I finally did anything about it, hoping it would somehow resolve itself. If even one of these 10 mistakes sounded uncomfortably familiar as you were watching, you're honestly not alone, not even close, and now you know exactly what to look out for before it costs you a plant, a pot, or an entire weekend untangling mint roots the hard way like I did. I've got more videos exactly like this one coming, breaking down the mistakes nobody talks about openly in gardening, so if that's genuinely useful to you, subscribing helps me keep making these videos consistently. Drop a comment below and tell me which one of these 10 surprised you the most, or better yet, tell me your own container gardening regret. I read every single comment that comes through, and some of your stories might even end up featured in a future video down the line. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.